wind tore across the cliff top with a force that made Alara Whitmore stumble, and still she did not stop walking. Rain had not yet fallen, but the sky over the harbor town of Cranmore had turned the color of a bruise, and the sea below was churning white against the rocks. She held a small bundle of flowers close to her chest, wrapped in brown paper, the stems already bending from the wind. She had walked this same path every Sunday for 6 years, and not once had she missed a single week. Not through sickness, not through grief, not through the bitter winters that froze the grass beneath her boots. She reached the flat stone at the edge of the cliff, the one worn smooth by her own knees, and knelt without hesitation. Below her, the water crashed and pulled back, as if it were breathing. She unwrapped the flowers, white lilies today, and laid them gently at the very edge, where the wind would eventually carry them down into the waves. She did not cry. She had cried enough years ago that her body seemed to have run out of tears for this particular grief. She only whispered a few words, too quiet for anyone to hear, and stood again, brushing the dirt from her skirt. She did not know that she was being watched. Duke Ashford Cole stood at the tall window of his study, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand, staring down at the small figure on the cliff. He had arrived at Cranmore Hall only 3 weeks earlier, called back from London to manage the estate his father had left in disorder, and in that short time, the woman on the cliff had become the strangest fixture of his new life. Every Sunday, without fail, she came. Every Sunday she knelt at the same spot, laid flowers at the same edge, and left without speaking to a single soul. He had asked his steward about her once, a man named Mr. Whitfield, gray at the temples and careful with his words. Whitfield had only shrugged and said that the girl had been doing it for years, and that most of the town had stopped wondering why. That answer had not satisfied Ashford. If anything, it had deepened his curiosity into something closer to an ache. He set down the brandy and watched until she disappeared over the ridge, swallowed by the gray light, and then he turned from the window, telling himself, as he had told himself every Sunday since his arrival, that it was none of his concern. But the thought followed him through the empty halls of Cranmore Hall like a shadow that would not leave. That evening, a storm broke properly over the coast, rattling the windows of the great house and sending the staff scurrying to secure the shutters. Ashford sat alone in the dining room, the long table set for one, the candles flickering with each gust that found its way through the old stone walls. He thought of the woman on the cliff, out there somewhere in the town below, and wondered, absurdly, if she was safe. He had inherited a great deal from his father, the title, the land, the crumbling house with its unpaid debts and its unspoken secrets, but he had not inherited any patience for mysteries, and this woman, whoever she was, had become one the moment he first saw her kneeling at the edge of the world. The next morning he rode into the village on the pretense of business, though he had none that could not have waited another week. Cranmore was a small place, built along a curving harbor, its cottages huddled together against the wind, its fishing boats bobbing in gray water. He tied his horse outside the general shop and stepped inside, the bell above the door announcing his arrival to a room that fell instantly quiet. The shopkeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Pratt, straightened at the sight of him, smoothing her apron with visible nerves. A duke rarely walked into her shop himself. He asked for tobacco he did not smoke, and tea he did not need, and as she wrapped his purchases, he asked, as casually as he could manage, about the young woman who visited the cliff each Sunday. Mrs. Pratt's hands paused for just a moment over the paper wrapping. She glanced toward the window, toward the street outside, as though checking that no one was near enough to hear. "Her name is Alara," the shopkeeper said quietly. "Alara Whitmore. Her family has lived here longer than most. She lost someone, years back. The sea took him. That is all I know, sir. And truthfully, that is all anyone here cares to say." Ashford thanked her and left with his tobacco and tea, neither of which he wanted, and stood outside the shop for a long moment, watching the gulls circle over the harbor. Alara Whitmore. The name settled into his mind and refused to leave. He saw her again 2 days later, entirely by accident, or so he told himself. She was at the edge of the market square, selecting apples from a cart, her dark hair pulled back beneath a plain wool bonnet, her dress simple and worn at the hem but clean and carefully mended. She moved with a quiet efficiency, the kind of movement that belonged to someone who had learned long ago not to waste time or attention on things that did not matter. He found himself walking toward her before he had decided to do so. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and she turned, startled, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of him. The whole square seemed to notice at once, conversations quieting, heads turning. A duke did not typically address a fisherman's daughter by name in the open street. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a small, stiff curtsy, her voice careful and even. "I did not expect you to know my name." Cranmore is smaller than London, he said, attempting something like lightness. Names travel quickly here, it seems. She said nothing to that, only waited, her posture polite but guarded, as though she expected the conversation to end as quickly as it had begun. He found himself searching for something to say, some way to keep her there a moment longer, though he could not have explained why it mattered so much. "I have seen you," he said finally, choosing his words with more care than he had used in years. "On the cliff path. On Sundays." Something shifted in her expression, so brief he almost missed it. Not quite hurt, not quite anger, something closer to exhaustion, the look of a person who had been asked a question too many times by people who did not truly wish to understand the answer. "Yes, Your Grace," she said simply. "I walk there most Sundays." He waited, half hoping she would offer more, but she only held his gaze with a quiet steadiness that unsettled him far more than tears would have. He understood, in that moment, that whatever question he wanted to ask, she would not welcome it standing in the middle of a crowded market square, with half the town watching. "I hope you have a pleasant afternoon, Miss Whitmore," he said instead, and stepped back, allowing her to return to her apples. She curtsied again, murmured something polite, and turned away, and he stood there far longer than was proper, watching her disappear into the crowd, the question he had almost asked, still burning unspoken in his chest. That night, he could not sleep. He lay in the enormous bed his father had died in, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the wind pressing against the windows, and he thought of her face in the market square, the careful blankness she had worn like armor. He thought of the flowers at the cliff edge, carried away each week by the wind and the water, never once collected, never once left to wilt where anyone could see them decay. He rose before dawn the next day, though it was not Sunday, and walked the grounds of the estate alone, past the old stables, past the overgrown gardens his mother had once tended before her own death years ago. From the eastern edge of the property, he could see the harbor below, the boats returning with the morning catch, smoke rising thin and gray from the chimneys of Cranmore. He thought of his own losses, the mother he barely remembered, the father he had never truly known, and wondered if grief looked the same on every person, or if it wore a different shape depending on what exactly had been taken. He did not yet know that the answer to Alara's flowers was tangled, impossibly, with his own family's history, buried in letters he had not yet found, in a truth his father had spent his final years trying to forget. He knew only that something about the woman on the cliff had lodged itself beneath his ribs and would not be shaken loose, and that whatever waited to be uncovered would not stay hidden much longer. As he turned back toward the house, the first bell of the village church rang out over the water, calling the fishermen and their families to another ordinary day, unaware that among them walked two people whose separate griefs were about to become, slowly and painfully, one shared story. Later that morning, Ashford summoned Mr. Whitfield to the study, intending to speak of the estate accounts, the leaking roof over the west wing, the tenants who had fallen behind on their rents. Instead, he found himself asking, once again, about Alara Whitmore, and this time he did not let the steward brush the question aside so easily. Whitfield stood near the door, his hat in his hands, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "it is not my place to speak of the private grief of the villagers. If Miss Whitmore wished her story known, she would have told it herself by now, and yet you know it," Ashford said, watching the older man's face. Whitfield hesitated, then sighed, setting his hat on the edge of the desk. "I know pieces of it, Your Grace, the way anyone in Cranmore knows pieces of the things that happen here. I know she had a younger brother. I know the sea took him when he was still a boy, no more than 16. I know she has never once spoken his name aloud in front of another soul since the day it happened. Beyond that, you would need to ask her yourself, and I would advise against it, unless you are prepared for whatever answer she gives." Ashford turned the words over in his mind long after Whitfield had left the room. A brother, 16 years old, the sea. It explained the flowers, certainly, but it did not explain the particular quality of her sorrow, the way she carried it so silently, as though the grief itself were a secret rather than simply a loss. He tried to distract himself with the estate ledgers for the remainder of the day, but the numbers blurred together, and his mind kept drifting back to the cliff, to the flat stone worn smooth by years of kneeling, to the flowers carried off by wind and tide before anyone else could see them. That evening he walked down to the harbor alone, without informing his household, dressed plainly enough that he hoped to pass unnoticed among the fishermen mending their nets in the fading light. He found an old man sitting on an overturned crate near the water, pipe in hand, watching the boats sway gently against their moorings. The old man introduced himself as Tobias, a fisherman who had worked these waters for over 50 years, and when Ashford asked, carefully, about the Whitmore family. Something in the old man's weathered face grew still. "That is not my story to tell, sir," Tobias said, not unkindly. "But I will say this much. Whatever you have heard about the sea taking her brother, there is more to it than the town lets on. Some things get buried quietly, when the people who could speak of them decide silence is easier than truth." Ashford pressed gently for more, but Tobias only shook his head and returned his attention to his pipe. The conversation closed as firmly as a door. Ashford thanked him and walked back toward Cranmore Hall in the darkening evening, the old man's words circling in his mind like gulls over the harbor. Something buried. Someone who had chosen silence over truth. He did not yet understand how close that buried truth sat to his own family's name, but as he climbed the hill toward the great house, its windows glowing faintly against the night, he felt, for the first time since arriving in Cranmore, that he had stepped into a story far larger than a lonely woman and her Sunday flowers. Lightning split the sky over Cranmore just as Alara reached her cottage door, and she barely made it inside before the rain came down in sheets, hammering against the thin roof like 1,000 small fists. She dropped her basket on the kitchen table and stood for a moment in the dark, listening to the storm rattle the shutters, and thought, as she often did on nights like this, of her brother Peter, who had loved storms more than any boy had a right to. She lit a single candle and sat by the window, watching the rain streak the glass, and did not notice at first the figure struggling up the muddy path toward her door until a fist knocked against the wood, urgent and heavy. She opened it to find Duke Ashford Cole standing on her step, soaked through, his coat plastered to his shoulders, his hair dripping into his eyes. "Your Grace," she said, too startled for anything more graceful. "What on earth are you doing out in this?" "I was riding back from the eastern farms when the storm broke," he said, slightly breathless. "I could not make it back to the hall. Yours was the nearest light." She hesitated only a moment before stepping back and allowing him inside, though every instinct told her that a duke standing dripping in her small kitchen was a situation with no good outcome. She fetched a towel, one of the few good ones she owned, and handed it to him without meeting his eyes. "You may sit by the fire until the worst of it passes," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I will make tea." He thanked her and lowered himself into the single chair near the hearth, watching as she moved about the small kitchen with quiet efficiency, setting a kettle over the fire, retrieving cups from a shelf that held only 4. The cottage was small but immaculately kept, every surface clean, every object placed with evident care, and he found himself noticing, with a strange ache, how carefully she had built a life out of so little. They sat in silence for a while, the storm roaring outside, the fire crackling low, and Ashford found himself studying her face in the firelight, the sharp line of her jaw, the tired shadows beneath her eyes that no amount of composure could fully hide. "I did not mean to intrude on your evening," he said finally. "You did not intrude," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "The sea does not ask permission before it sends a storm. I suppose neither do dukes." He almost laughed at that, surprised by the dry humor beneath her careful words, and for a moment something in her expression softened as well, a flicker of amusement she seemed to catch and suppress almost as quickly as it appeared. They spoke of small things at first, the state of the roads, the price of fish that season, the repairs her cottage still needed before winter properly set in. He learned that she took in needlework to supplement whatever her father earned from the boats, that she had taught herself to read from a single battered book left behind by her mother, that she had never once left Cranmore in her entire life. "And you, Your Grace," she asked eventually, glancing at him with something like genuine curiosity. "Do you intend to stay, now that you have inherited the hall, or will you return to London once the accounts are settled and leave Cranmore to manage itself again?" The question caught him off guard, mostly because he did not yet know the answer himself. "I am not certain," he admitted. "My father let a great deal fall into disrepair before he died. There is much to fix here, more than I expected. I find myself less eager to return to London than I once was." She studied him for a long moment, as though weighing whether to believe him, and then looked away toward the fire. "Cranmore does that to people," she said quietly. "It gets into your blood, whether you want it to or not. My family has been here for 4 generations. I do not know how to imagine myself anywhere else." The storm showed no sign of easing, and as the hours passed, their conversation grew easier, less guarded, drifting from small talk into something closer to honesty. He told her, hesitantly, about his mother's death when he was a boy, about the strange, hollow years afterward when his father had withdrawn into himself and left Ashford largely to raise himself under the care of tutors and servants. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she offered no false comfort, only a quiet nod that told him she understood something of that particular kind of loneliness. "You watch me on Sundays," she said suddenly, catching him off guard with the directness of it. "From the window of the hall. I have seen you there, more than once." He felt heat rise in his face, caught in his own quiet trespass. "I did not mean to make you uncomfortable," he said. "I only wondered." "Everyone wonders," she said, her voice carrying a tired edge. "For years, everyone in this town wondered, and eventually they stopped asking, because I stopped answering. It became easier that way. For me, and for them." He held very still, aware that the conversation had arrived at the edge of something important, something she might close off entirely if he pushed too hard or too fast. Instead, he let the silence sit between them, the fire popping softly, the rain easing at last into a gentler patter against the roof. "You do not have to tell me anything," he said finally. "I did not come here tonight to demand an explanation for something that is clearly yours to keep or share as you choose." She looked at him then, really looked, as though reassessing something she had assumed about him from the start. "I know that most men in your position would have simply asked outright, expecting an answer because of who they are," she said. "You did not. I have learned," he said carefully, "that the things people carry quietly are usually the things that matter most to them. I would rather wait for the truth than take it before it is offered." Something in her posture eased slightly at that, the careful armor she wore around herself loosening by a fraction, though she still did not speak of her brother, not that night. Instead, she asked him about London, about the life he had left behind, and he found himself telling her more than he had told anyone in years, about the emptiness of society gatherings, about the loneliness of a title that came with land and money, but very little genuine companionship. By the time the storm finally passed, the fire had burned low, and the candle had guttered halfway down, and neither of them had noticed how many hours had slipped by. He rose reluctantly, aware that propriety demanded he leave before the household staff began to worry, and she walked him to the door, the cold night air rushing in as she opened it. "Thank you for the shelter, Miss Whitmore," he said, and meant it far more deeply than the simple words suggested. "Alara will do," she said quietly, surprising them both. "If we are to keep meeting in storms, Your Grace, we might as well dispense with some of the formality." He smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and something in her chest tightened unexpectedly at the sight of it. "Then you must call me Ashford," he said, "when there is no one else near enough to be scandalized by it." She did not agree aloud, but she did not object either, and as he walked back up the muddy hill toward Cranmore Hall beneath a sky finally clearing to reveal scattered stars, he found himself thinking not of ledgers or leaking roofs or unpaid tenants, but of the quiet strength in her voice, and the careful way she guarded a grief she had never once let the town witness. Behind him, Alara stood at her window long after his figure had disappeared into the darkness, watching the last of the storm clouds drift away from the coast, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a small and unfamiliar warmth beginning to stir beneath the careful stillness she had built around her heart. The following morning, Cranmore woke to clear skies, and the particular brightness that follows a heavy storm, puddles gleaming in the ruts of the village road, gulls wheeling and calling over a harbor scrubbed clean by the night's rain. Alara rose early, as she always did, and found herself, despite every effort not to, thinking of the Duke's smile as she prepared her morning tea. She scolded herself for it. A man of his rank had no business occupying her thoughts, and she had no business allowing it. There was too much distance between a duke and a fisherman's daughter, too much history in Cranmore of women who had let themselves hope for more than their station allowed, only to be left with nothing but regret and whispered gossip. She had watched it happen to others. She would not let it happen to herself. And yet, as she walked to the market that morning, her basket over her arm, she found her eyes drifting toward the hill where Cranmore Hall stood against the brightening sky, and she could not entirely suppress the small, foolish hope that had taken root in her chest sometime during the long hours of the storm. At the hall, Ashford faced a very different kind of morning. Mr. Whitfield arrived at dawn with a stack of correspondence and a look of poorly concealed curiosity, having clearly heard from the stable hands that his employer had returned near midnight, soaked and smiling in a way none of them had seen since his arrival in Cranmore. "You seem in good spirits this morning, Your Grace," Whitfield ventured carefully, setting the letters on the desk. "The storm was refreshing," Ashford said simply, offering nothing further, though the small smile he could not quite suppress told Whitfield everything the words did not. Ashford spent the morning attempting to focus on estate business, reviewing tenant agreements and correspondence from London solicitors regarding his father's remaining debts, but his mind kept drifting back to the small, warm kitchen, to Alara's quiet laughter at his joke about dukes and storms, to the careful way she had studied him, as though deciding, piece by piece, whether he could be trusted. He found himself, by early afternoon, riding down toward the harbor again, though he told himself it was merely to inspect the condition of the docks, which technically fell under the estate's responsibility. He spotted her near the fish market, speaking with an older woman he recognized as one of the town's midwives, and he slowed his horse, uncertain whether to approach. She noticed him before he could decide, and to his surprise, she did not look away or retreat into the careful formality of their earlier meetings. Instead, she offered a small nod, an acknowledgement that felt, somehow, like an invitation. He dismounted and crossed the square toward her, aware of the curious glances from the surrounding stalls, aware that their conversation the previous night, private as it had felt within the walls of her cottage, would likely become common knowledge in Cranmore by nightfall regardless of what either of them did now. "Miss Whitmore," he said, with careful formality for the benefit of the watching town, "I trust you suffered no ill effects from last night's storm." "None at all, Your Grace," she replied, matching his tone, though her eyes carried a warmth that had not been there in their first meeting. "Though I confess my kitchen has never before hosted such distinguished company." The midwife beside her, an older woman named Mrs. Fenwick, watched the exchange with open interest, and Ashford caught the knowing look that passed between the two women, the kind of look shared by people who understood exactly what was beginning to unfold, even before the two people at its center fully understood it themselves. He did not stay long, aware of the impropriety of lingering, but before he turned to leave he asked, quietly enough that only she could hear, whether she might walk with him along the harbor path the following evening, once her work was finished for the day. She hesitated, weighing the request against every instinct that told her such things ended badly for women in her position, and then, surprising herself as much as him, she agreed. That single word, spoken so quietly it was nearly lost beneath the calling of the gulls, settled something in Ashford's chest that he had not realized was unsettled until that very moment. He thanked her, bowed slightly, more than propriety strictly required, and returned to his horse, aware of Mrs. Fenwick's knowing smile following him across the square. As he rode back up the hill toward Cranmore Hall, he allowed himself, for the first time since his father's death, to imagine a future in Cranmore that involved something more than duty and inherited debt. He thought of Alara's quiet strength, the careful way she had built a life from so little, the flowers she carried to the cliff each Sunday for a brother whose story he had only just begun to glimpse. He did not yet know that the answer to her grief lay buried in his own father's private papers, locked in a drawer he had not yet found reason to open, or that the truth, once uncovered, would demand more courage from him than anything he had faced in London's most demanding drawing rooms. She did not yet know that the Duke who had sheltered from her storm carried, buried within his own family's history, the missing piece of the very grief she guarded so closely, or that the truth, once it surfaced, would test everything she believed about trust, about forgiveness, and about the fragile, uncertain shape of love, arriving from the most unexpected direction. The lighthouse keeper's bell rang wildly across the water, 3 sharp tolls that meant one thing to everyone in Cranmore. A storm had turned faster and fiercer than anyone expected, and every boat still out needed to make land immediately. Alara stood on the harbor wall with the other women, scanning the churning gray water for the small shapes of returning boats, her heart pounding with a fear she knew too well. She counted the boats as they came in, 1, 2, 3, the fishermen leaping onto the docks and securing their lines with practiced speed, but the count fell short. Her father's boat was not among them. She was already moving toward the harbormaster's post when a hand caught her arm, steadying her against the wind that threatened to knock her from her feet. "Alara," Ashford said, his voice raised over the storm. "What has happened?" "My father," she said, her composure cracking for the first time since he had known her. "He went out with 2 others before the wind changed. They are not back yet." Without hesitation, Ashford turned toward the harbormaster, a broad man named Mr. Doyle who was already organizing a rescue effort, shouting instructions to a group of fishermen preparing to launch a second boat despite the danger. Ashford offered whatever resources the estate could provide: lanterns, rope, horses to carry word along the coast if the boat had been driven onto the rocks further down. Alara stood at the edge of the harbor wall, rain lashing her face, watching the rescue boat disappear into the darkness and the churning waves, and Ashford stayed beside her, saying nothing, simply present, a solid and unmoving anchor against the storm raging around them both. An hour passed, then 2, the longest of Alara's life since the night, years ago, when she had stood on this same wall waiting for news that never came the way she had hoped. She gripped the stone railing until her knuckles went white, and Ashford, without asking permission, placed his hand gently over hers, offering what comfort he could without words. When the rescue boat finally returned, towing her father's damaged vessel behind it, all three men aboard cold and shaken but alive, Ilara's legs nearly gave out beneath her with relief. She ran to the dock as her father was helped ashore, wrapping her arms around him despite the rain and the cold and the salt water soaking through both their clothes. Ashford watched from a respectful distance, something tight and unfamiliar loosening in his own chest at the sight of her relief, and it was only later, once her father had been settled by the fire in a neighbor's cottage with hot broth and dry blankets, that Ilara finally allowed herself to fully break down, the fear of the last several hours crashing over her all at once. She found herself, without quite deciding to, walking toward the old lighthouse at the edge of the harbor, the one place in Cranmore where she had always gone as a girl when the weight of the world grew too heavy to carry alone. Ashford followed at a distance, uncertain whether his presence would comfort or intrude, but when she reached the lighthouse door and found it locked against the storm, she turned and saw him standing there, and did not ask him to leave. They took shelter together in the small stone structure at the base of the lighthouse, a storage room used by the keeper for spare lamp oil and rope, the storm howling outside while a single lantern cast flickering light across the narrow space. Ilara sat on an overturned crate, her arms wrapped around herself, still trembling from cold and the aftermath of fear, and Ashford removed his own coat without a word and draped it over her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling the heavy fabric closer, "for staying tonight, for helping look for him." "Of course," he said simply, settling onto a second crate across from her, close enough that their knees nearly touched in the small space. "I could not have done otherwise." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the lantern flame, and when she finally spoke, her voice had changed, stripped of its usual careful control, worn thin by the night's terror and the years of grief that had preceded it. "Tonight felt like it did the night we lost Peter," she said quietly. "My brother, waiting on that wall, counting boats, praying the numbers would come out right." Ashford went very still, aware that she had finally arrived at the story he had wondered about since his first week in Cranmore, and he said nothing, giving her the space to continue at whatever pace she needed. "He was 16, she said, her eyes fixed on the lantern flame rather than on Ashford's face. "Younger than me by 3 years, reckless in the way that boys that age often are, convinced the sea could never truly hurt him because he loved it too much to imagine it turning against him." She paused, gathering herself, and Ashford waited, resisting every urge to fill the silence with comfort that would only interrupt the truth she was finally ready to share. "There was a boy visiting Cranmore that summer," she continued. "A nobleman's son, come to stay at some grand house along the coast, though I never learned exactly whose. He and his friends had taken a small boat out past the point, showing off, the way wealthy young men sometimes do when they have never once been told no. The current caught them faster than they expected. Their boat capsized nearly a mile from shore." Ashford felt something cold settle in his stomach, though he could not yet have said why. "Peter saw them from the cliff," she said. "He did not hesitate. He never hesitated, not once in his life. And that was both the best and worst thing about him. He swam out alone, because there was no time to gather help, no time to launch a proper boat. He reached the nobleman's son first, got him to a rock where he could hold on until help arrived. He went back for the others." Her voice broke slightly, and Ashford reached across the small space between them, taking her hand without thinking, and she let him, gripping his fingers tightly as she forced herself to finish the story. "He saved 2 of the 3 boys that day," she said. "The current took him before he could reach the last one. They found his body 2 days later, washed up nearly 10 miles down the coast, and the family of the boy he saved, the boy whose life my brother gave his own to protect, never once came to thank us, never once acknowledged what he had done. They simply took their son and left Cranmore within the week, and it was as though Peter had never existed to them at all." Ashford sat in stunned silence, the pieces of a story he had heard fragments of finally arranging themselves into something whole and devastating, and beneath the grief he felt for her, a cold unease began to stir, a suspicion he could not yet fully name but that pressed against his thoughts, like a splinter working its way toward the surface. "That is why the flowers," he said quietly, more statement than question. She nodded, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of his coat, still wrapped around her shoulders. "I could not bear the thought of no one remembering him," she said. "If his own family could not properly honor what he did, then I decided I would do it myself, every single week, for as long as I am able. It is not much, but it is something. It means he is not entirely forgotten, even if the people who owe him everything chose to forget." Ashford held her hand in the flickering lantern light, the storm still raging outside the small stone walls, and felt the weight of a suspicion settling more firmly into certainty with every word she spoke. Cranmore Hall, his own family's coastal properties. A nobleman's son sent away quietly after a near tragedy at sea, a summer his own father had never once discussed, not even in his final, rambling years before death. He did not say any of this aloud, not yet, not while she sat before him raw and vulnerable, having finally shared a grief she had carried alone for 6 long years. Instead, he simply held her hand, and when she finally leaned against his shoulder, exhausted by the night's fear and the weight of long-buried memory, he wrapped his arm carefully around her, offering what warmth and steadiness he could. They stayed in the small stone shelter until the storm finally passed, sometime near dawn, neither of them speaking further, both lost in their own thoughts, though for entirely different reasons. Ilara felt, for the first time in years, the strange relief of a secret finally shared, a weight set down after being carried alone for far too long. Ashford felt something far heavier settling over him, the growing certainty that the family responsible for her brother's uncelebrated sacrifice was his own, and that somewhere in the locked drawers of his father's study, the truth waited to confirm what his heart had already begun to suspect. When the first gray light of dawn finally broke over the harbor, they emerged from the lighthouse shelter together, the sea calmer now, the sky washed clean by the night's violence. Ilara returned his coat, thanking him quietly for staying with her through the worst of it, and he walked her back toward her cottage in the pale morning light, neither of them speaking of what would come next, both aware, in different ways, that something had shifted permanently between them during the long hours of that storm. At her door she turned to him, her eyes still red from crying but steadier now than they had been the night before. "Thank you, Ashford," she said, using his given name for only the second time since they had met. "For being there. For listening. It has been a long time since I let anyone see that much of what I carry. I am glad you did," he said, and meant it completely, though beneath the words sat the growing weight of a truth he was not yet ready to share, one that could either deepen the fragile trust building between them, or shatter it entirely, depending on how and when he finally found the courage to speak it. He walked back up the hill toward Cranmore Hall as the village slowly woke around him, fishermen inspecting storm damage along the docks, women hanging washed linens in the returning sunlight, and felt, with each step, the mounting certainty that he could not put off searching his father's private papers any longer. Whatever truth waited in that locked drawer, he owed it to Ilara, and to the memory of a brother she had spent 6 years quietly honoring, to finally bring it into the light. By the time he reached the hall, exhaustion had settled deep into his bones, but sleep felt impossible with the weight of what he now suspected pressing so heavily on his mind. He went instead to his father's old study, a room he had avoided since arriving in Cranmore, its shelves still lined with ledgers and correspondence untouched since the old Duke's death. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, reluctant to disturb the stillness of a space that still smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old paper, before finally stepping inside. The desk held little of interest at first glance: ordinary business correspondence, receipts for repairs long completed, letters from tenants requesting extensions on their rent. He worked through drawer after drawer with growing frustration, finding nothing that confirmed or denied the suspicion taking root in his chest. It was only when he reached the bottom drawer on the desk's left side, locked and slightly warped from age, that his search finally slowed. He searched the desk itself for a key and found none, and rather than force the lock and risk damaging whatever lay inside, he decided the matter required patience he did not currently possess after a sleepless night. He resolved to return to the search once he had rested, though rest, when it finally came, offered little relief, his dreams tangled with images of storms and drowning boys and Ilara's tear-streaked face in lantern light. He woke past midday to find Mr. Whitfield waiting outside his chamber, concerned by his master's unusually late rising, and Ashford, still gathering his thoughts, asked the steward directly whether he knew anything of a locked drawer in the old Duke's study. Whitfield's expression grew careful in a way that confirmed Ashford's suspicions before the man spoke a single word. "Your father kept certain papers private, Your Grace," he said slowly. "Family matters, mostly. I was never given cause nor permission to look into them myself, and I confess I never wished to." "Do you know where the key might be kept?" Ashford asked, and Whitfield, after a long hesitation, admitted that the old Duke had worn a small brass key on a chain beneath his shirt in his final years, one that had likely been buried with him, or perhaps left among his personal effects, stored in a trunk in the attic that no one had opened since the funeral. Ashford spent the remainder of that afternoon in the dusty attic of Cranmore Hall, surrounded by decades of accumulated family history, old portraits with cracked frames, trunks of clothing long out of fashion, Boxes of correspondence yellowed with age. He found his father's personal trunk near the far wall, beneath a canvas sheet thick with dust, and inside it, wrapped carefully in a handkerchief, the small brass key Whitfield had described. He carried it downstairs to the study with a strange sense of dread settling over him, aware that once that drawer opened, there would be no returning to the comfortable uncertainty he had lived with since first noticing Alara on the cliff. Whatever truth waited inside would demand something of him, a reckoning with his own family's failures that he was not yet certain he possessed the courage to face. He did not open the drawer that evening. Instead, he sat before the locked desk for nearly an hour, the small brass key resting in his palm, thinking of Alara's voice in the lighthouse shelter, of her brother's name spoken aloud for the first time in years, of the quiet dignity with which she had carried a grief that deserved so much more acknowledgement than she had ever received. He thought, too, of what it would mean for both of them if his suspicions proved true, the fragile trust they had only just begun building threatened by a truth neither of them had chosen but both would now have to face. Eventually, he set the key aside, unopened, and told himself he would face the drawer's contents when he felt more prepared for whatever truth it held. But even as he climbed the stairs toward his chamber that night, he understood that preparation was a luxury he could not afford for long. Alara had waited 6 years for someone to acknowledge her brother's sacrifice. She did not deserve to wait any longer than necessary for the truth that Ashford now suspected only he could provide. Down in the village, Alara sat beside her father's bed long after the household had gone quiet, watching him sleep off the worst of the night's exhaustion, grateful beyond words that the count of returning boats had, in the end, come out whole. She thought of Ashford's steady presence beside her on the harbor wall, his hand covering hers without hesitation, the quiet way he had simply stayed rather than offering empty words of comfort. She had not intended to tell him about Peter, not that night, not perhaps ever, and yet something about the terror of nearly losing her father again had cracked open a door she had kept firmly shut for 6 long years. She found, to her own surprise, that she did not regret it. For the first time since her brother's death, the grief felt slightly less like a burden carried alone, and slightly more like something shared, however carefully, with a man she was only beginning to understand she trusted. She did not yet know what that trust would soon be asked to withstand, or how close the truth of her brother's forgotten sacrifice sat to the very man who had held her hand through the worst of the storm. The lock gave way with a small, sharp click that seemed unreasonably loud in the silence of the study, and Ashford sat frozen for a moment, the brass key still between his fingers, staring at the drawer he had finally worked up the courage to open. 3 days had passed since the storm, 3 days of avoiding this moment while he attended to estate matters that suddenly felt trivial compared to the truth waiting inches away. He drew the drawer open slowly. Inside, neatly bundled with faded ribbon, sat a collection of letters and documents, yellowed with age, along with a small portrait of a boy no older than 14, fair-haired and solemn-faced, that Ashford did not immediately recognize. He untied the ribbon with careful fingers and began to read. The first letter was written in his father's hand, dated some 16 years earlier, addressed to a solicitor in London regarding arrangements for a boy named Edwin, described only as a distant cousin requiring quiet placement with a family in the north, far from Cranmore, with strict instructions that the matter never be discussed within hearing of the household staff. Ashford's hands grew unsteady as he continued reading. A second letter, this one from the solicitor, confirmed that arrangements had been made, that the boy Edwin had been settled with a family near York under a modified name, that all expenses would be handled quietly through the estate's accounts without any public record connecting him to the Cole family name. He found, further down in the bundle, a third letter, this one far more revealing than the first 2, written by his father to his own brother, Ashford's uncle, some weeks after whatever incident had prompted Edwin's sudden removal from Cranmore. The letter spoke, in careful, guarded language, of an accident at sea that summer, of a local fisherman's son who had drowned attempting to save Edwin and 2 other boys after their small boat capsized near the point, and of the family's decision that acknowledging the sacrifice publicly would only invite scandal and unwanted scrutiny into how the boys had come to be unsupervised on the water in the first place. Ashford read the letter twice, then a third time, his stomach turning cold with each pass through the careful, cowardly language his father had used to justify abandoning any acknowledgement of a boy who had died saving his family's own blood. Edwin, the letter explained, had been the son of a distant relation who had died some years prior, taken in by the Cole family out of obligation rather than affection, and sent to Cranmore that summer while arrangements were made for his more permanent placement elsewhere. His near drowning and the death of the local boy who saved him had become, in his father's own written words, an inconvenience best resolved through quiet removal and careful silence, rather than public gratitude that might complicate the family's reputation. Ashford set the letter down, his hands trembling now with an anger he had rarely felt toward his own father, a man he had spent his whole life trying, without much success, to understand and respect. He sat in the dim study for a long time, the portrait of young Edwin propped against a stack of letters, the truth of Peter Whitmore's death laid bare in his father's own careless handwriting. He thought of Alara kneeling at the cliff edge every Sunday, faithfully honoring a brother whose sacrifice his own family had deliberately erased from memory to protect their comfort and reputation. He thought of 6 years of silence, 6 years of her carrying that grief entirely alone, believing the boy her brother saved had simply vanished without a trace of gratitude, when in truth, his own family had known exactly what happened and chosen, quite deliberately, to bury it. The weight of that knowledge settled over him like a stone, and for a long while, he could not decide what troubled him more, his father's cowardice, or the terrible position he now found himself in, holding a truth capable of either healing or destroying the fragile connection he had built with Alara over these past weeks. He did not sleep that night. He sat with the letters spread across his father's desk, reading them again and again, searching for some detail that might soften what he now understood, some indication that his father had felt even a flicker of remorse for his decision. He found none. The letters were businesslike, cold, more concerned with avoiding scandal than honoring a boy who had given his life to save another. By morning, exhaustion had worn down his anger into something closer to grim resolve. He understood, with total clarity, that he could not simply set the letters aside and continue as though he had never found them. Whatever it cost him, whatever risk it carried to the fragile bond growing between himself and Alara, she deserved the truth. Peter deserved, finally, the acknowledgement his family had denied him for 6 long years. He summoned Mr. Whitfield that morning, needing someone to confirm what the letters suggested before he carried the burden of that truth to Alara's door. He laid the documents before the steward without explanation and watched the older man's face carefully as he read through them. Whitfield's expression shifted from confusion to slow, dawning horror as he reached the third letter, the one detailing the arrangement made for young Edwin's quiet removal from Cranmore. He set the papers down with visible difficulty, his hands not quite steady. "I did not know the particulars, Your Grace," he said quietly. "I remember the summer, of course. I remember when the Whitmore boy drowned, and I remember a young relation of your father's staying at the Hall briefly that same season, though I never connected the two events, nor did anyone else outside the family, so far as I am aware. Your father was careful, very careful. He was cowardly," Ashford said flatly, and Whitfield did not disagree, only lowered his eyes in a manner that confirmed he had long harbored his own quiet doubts about the old Duke's character. "Do you intend to tell Miss Whitmore?" Whitfield asked carefully. "I do not see how I could live with myself otherwise," Ashford said. "She has spent 6 years believing her brother's sacrifice was met with nothing but silence and indifference. The truth is worse than indifference. The truth is that my family knew precisely what he did, and chose deliberately to erase it rather than face the discomfort of gratitude owed to a family beneath their notice." Whitfield considered this for a long moment before speaking again. "It will not be an easy conversation, Your Grace," he said. "Whatever trust has grown between you these past weeks, this truth may test it more severely than either of you expects. Grief transformed suddenly into anger is a different creature entirely from grief carried quietly alone." "I know," Ashford said, "but she deserves to choose how she carries this truth, whether in anger or in peace. It is not my place to make that choice for her by keeping silent, the way my father did." Whitfield gathered the letters carefully back into their leather folder and returned them to Ashford's hands, his expression softer now, something almost like respect visible beneath his usual careful reserve. "Your father was many things, Your Grace," he said quietly, "but I do not believe he was ever brave enough to do what you are about to do. That, if nothing else, speaks well of the Duke Cranmore now has." The words offered little comfort against the dread sitting heavy in Ashford's chest, but he thanked the steward regardless, and spent the remainder of the day in restless preparation, rehearsing words he knew would likely fail him the moment he stood before her. He spent the following days in a strange, distracted state, attending to estate business with only half his attention, while the letters sat locked once more in the study drawer, waiting for him to find the courage to act on what he now knew. He saw Alara twice during that time, once at the market, once during their now customary evening walk along the harbor path, and both times he found himself unable to meet her eyes for more than a few moments, terrified that she would somehow read the truth in his expression before he was ready to speak it aloud. She noticed his distraction, of course. She noticed everything, a habit born from years of careful observation, of watching a world that had taught her early to guard herself against unwelcome surprises. "You seem troubled, Ashford," she said one evening, as they walked along the harbor wall, the setting sun casting long gold light across the water. "Is something wrong at the Hall?" "Nothing that need concern you tonight," he said, hating himself immediately for the evasion, though he could not yet bring himself to say more. She studied him with the same careful attention she had once used to assess strangers approaching her market stall, searching for honesty beneath his words. And though she did not press further, he saw something guarded return to her expression, a wariness that had begun, slowly, to fade during their recent weeks together. They walked the remainder of the harbor path in a silence that felt different from the comfortable quiet they had grown used to sharing, this one edged with something unspoken and uneasy. When they reached her cottage, she did not invite him in as she sometimes did, only bid him a polite good night that carried a distance he had not heard in her voice since their earliest, most guarded conversations. He rode back to Cranmore Hall that night with a hollow feeling settling in his chest, aware that his silence, however well-intentioned, had already begun to cost him something with her, and that every day he delayed the truth only widened the gap he could feel opening between them. He thought of his father's letters locked once more in the study drawer, of Edwin's solemn young face in the small portrait, of Peter Whitmore's name spoken aloud for the first time in the lighthouse shelter, and understood that he could not allow fear of losing her trust to become its own quiet form of the same cowardice his father had practiced. The following 2 days passed in much the same uneasy fashion, Ashford distracted and withdrawn, Elara increasingly guarded in response, both of them sensing a shift neither fully understood, until finally, unable to bear the growing distance any longer, he resolved that the following morning, whatever the cost, he would finally speak the truth he had been carrying alone for far too long. That night, alone in his study once more, he made his decision. He would tell her everything, not through careful, measured revelation designed to protect himself from her anger, but with the full and uncomfortable truth, exactly as his father had written it, exactly as cowardly and shameful as it deserved to be understood. She had earned that honesty, whatever it cost him to give it. He drafted, then discarded, several possible ways of beginning the conversation, each attempt feeling inadequate against the weight of what he needed to say. Finally, he simply gathered the letters into a leather folder, resolved to bring them to her directly rather than attempting to soften the truth through careful paraphrasing that might, in the end, feel like another form of the same cowardice his father had practiced. The next morning, he rode down to her cottage before she had left for the market, and found her in her small garden, tending the few vegetables that survived the salt air and thin coastal soil. She looked up at his approach, surprised by the earliness of his visit, and something in his expression must have warned her that this was no ordinary morning call. "Ashford," she said, straightening, "what has happened?" "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "About your brother." Her face went very still, the careful composure she wore like armor settling firmly back into place, and she set down the small trowel in her hand with deliberate care, as though bracing herself for whatever came next. "Come inside," she said quietly, and led him toward her cottage door, both of them aware, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever followed would either deepen the trust growing between them beyond measure, or shatter it entirely beyond repair. Elara's hands trembled as she set 2 cups of tea on the small kitchen table, though neither of them made any move to drink. Ashford sat across from her, the leather folder resting on his knees, and for a long moment, neither spoke, the weight of what waited to be said pressing heavily against the small, quiet room. "Whatever this is," she said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled tension, "please just tell me. I have spent 6 years imagining every possible cruelty the world might still owe me. I would rather know the truth than sit here wondering which one has finally arrived." Ashford opened the folder with unsteady hands and laid the letters on the table between them, one by one, in the order he had found them. He did not attempt to soften the truth with careful framing or gentle preamble. He simply told her, plainly and completely, what he had discovered in his father's locked drawer. The boy named Edwin, the quiet arrangement to remove him from Cranmore, the letter that spoke of her brother's sacrifice as an inconvenience best buried rather than honored. Elara read the letters herself once he finished speaking, her face growing paler with each line, her hands gripping the edges of the table as though she needed something solid to hold on to. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and beneath the grief, Ashford saw something else building, a slow, cold anger he had never before witnessed in her. "Your family knew," she said, her voice shaking. "All this time, your family knew exactly what Peter did, and they said nothing. They took the boy he saved and vanished, and let this town believe that whoever survived that day simply did not care enough to acknowledge what he had given." "I know," Ashford said quietly, "and I understand if you cannot forgive that. I do not ask you to forgive my father. I only felt that you deserved to finally know the truth, whatever it costs me to have brought it to you." She stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, and Ashford remained seated, giving her the space she clearly needed, though every instinct in him wanted to reach for her, to offer some comfort he was not certain she would welcome in that moment. 6 years, she said, more to herself than to him. 6 years I knelt at that cliff, wondering if anyone beyond this town even remembered what my brother did. 6 years believing his sacrifice meant nothing to the very people it saved, and it was not that they forgot. It was that they chose to forget, deliberately, carefully, as though remembering him properly might have cost them something they were unwilling to pay. "I am so sorry," Ashford said, the words feeling desperately inadequate against the scale of what she carried. She turned to face him then, her expression a complicated mixture of grief and fury and something else he could not quite name. "And you," she said, "you are his son. You have lived in that house your entire life, benefited from everything your family's name and money provided, while your father buried the truth of what my brother gave, so that boy could live. I have not lived in that house my entire life," he said carefully, aware of how fragile the moment had become. "I was sent away to school young, and then to London, and I saw my father perhaps a handful of times each year after my mother's death. I did not know about Edwin. I did not know about your brother's sacrifice, not until I found those letters myself, days ago." "That does not undo what your family did," she said, though her voice had lost some of its sharp edge, exhaustion beginning to soften the anger into something quieter. "No," he agreed. "It does not. Nothing I say or do can undo 6 years of silence, or give you back the acknowledgement your brother should have received the moment he pulled that boy from the water. But I am here now, and I am not my father, and I will not choose silence the way he did, whatever it costs me." She sank back into her chair, the fight draining out of her all at once, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to age her several years in the span of a single moment. Ashford reached across the table then, hesitant, and when she did not pull away, he took her hand gently in both of his. "I do not know what to do with this," she admitted quietly. "I have spent so long being angry at an absence, at silence, at people who simply did not care enough to remember. I do not know how to be angry at someone who is sitting in front of me, trying to make it right." "You do not have to decide anything tonight," he said. "I only needed you to know the truth. Whatever you decide to do with it, whatever you decide about me, about us, that is entirely your choice to make, in your own time." She was quiet for a long while, staring at their joined hands on the table, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had steadied considerably, though it still carried the rawness of everything she had just processed. "What was the boy's name?" she asked. "Edwin. What became of him?" "I do not know," Ashford admitted. "The letters only confirm that he was sent to a family near York under an altered name. I intend to find out, if you wish it. I think he deserves to know the truth as well, that a boy gave his life to save him, and that his own family chose to hide that sacrifice rather than honor it." Alara considered this for a long moment, something thoughtful replacing the raw grief in her expression. "Yes," she said finally, "I would like to know. Not out of anger toward him, he was only a boy himself that summer, as young as Peter was, but he should know what was given for his life. It seems wrong that he alone remains ignorant of the truth that everyone else in this story has now been forced to face." Ashford nodded, relieved beyond words that she had not simply demanded he leave and never return, though he understood the conversation was far from finished. That trust once shaken required careful rebuilding rather than assumption of its automatic return. "I will write to the solicitor named in my father's letters," he said. "If Edwin can be found, I will make certain he learns the truth, gently, and in whatever way honors your brother's memory properly." "Thank you," she said quietly, and then, after a pause, added, "Thank you for telling me. I know it would have been easier for you to simply lock that drawer again and let the secret die with your father, the way he intended. I considered it," Ashford admitted honestly. "For perhaps a single terrible hour, I considered simply forgetting I had ever found those letters. But I could not do it, not once I understood what silence had already cost you." She studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, the careful walls she had maintained since his arrival in Cranmore beginning, slowly, to lower once more, though not entirely, not yet. "I need time," she said finally, "to sit with this, to decide what it means, for Peter's memory, for this town, for whatever exists between us. I am not angry at you, Ashford. I want you to understand that clearly, but I cannot simply move past 6 years of grief in a single evening, however honestly you have tried to make it right." "I understand completely," he said, and meant it. "Take whatever time you need. I am not going anywhere, and neither is the truth. It will still be here. whenever you are ready to decide what comes next." He left her cottage as the evening light began fading toward dusk, walking back up the hill toward Cranmore Hall with a strange mixture of relief and dread settling over him. Relief that he had finally spoken the truth after days of unbearable silence. Dread that the fragile trust between them might still not survive the weight of what his own family had done. Behind him, Elara sat alone at her kitchen table long after he had gone, the letters still spread before her, reading them again and again, searching each careful, cowardly sentence for some detail that might make sense of 6 years of silent grief. She thought of Peter's face, the reckless courage that had defined him even as a small boy, and felt, beneath the anger and the grief, a strange and unexpected gratitude that the truth had finally surfaced, however painful its arrival. She thought too of Ashford's steady presence throughout the telling, the way he had not attempted to soften his family's failure or excuse his father's cowardice, the way he had simply laid the truth before her and trusted her to decide what to do with it. It was, she realized slowly, an entirely different kind of courage than her brother's had been. Quieter, less dramatic, but no less real for its lack of grand gesture. She did not yet know how she would carry this new knowledge forward, whether it would deepen her grief or finally begin to ease it, whether the careful trust growing between herself and Ashford could survive the revelation of his family's role in her brother's forgotten sacrifice. But as the candle burned low and the letters remained spread across her table, she found herself thinking, for the first time in 6 years, that perhaps her brother's memory might finally receive the acknowledgement it had always deserved, and that the man responsible for finally bringing that truth into the light might yet prove himself worthy of the fragile hope beginning, despite everything, to take root in her heart. The following morning, Ashford kept his word without delay. He wrote immediately to the solicitor named in his father's old correspondence, a firm still operating in London under the same family name, requesting whatever information could be gathered regarding a boy named Edwin, placed with a family near York some 16 years earlier, under circumstances the letter described only as sensitive and requiring discretion. The reply, when it finally arrived nearly 2 weeks later, confirmed that Edwin had grown into a schoolmaster in a small town outside York, married with 2 young children of his own, entirely unaware of the true circumstances surrounding his removal from Cranmore as a boy. The solicitor's letter included a cautious note suggesting that any contact be handled with sensitivity, given how many years had passed and how little the man likely remembered of that summer beyond vague, half-formed childhood memories of a frightening accident at sea. Ashford brought the news to Elara that same evening, finding her in her garden once more, and this time she invited him inside without hesitation, the guardedness of their last conversation having softened considerably during the 2 weeks apart. She listened carefully as he read the solicitor's letter aloud, her expression thoughtful rather than pained. "A schoolmaster," she said quietly when he finished. "Peter would have liked that, I think. He always said he wanted to teach the younger children in the village to swim properly, so that fewer families would ever have to stand on that harbor wall counting boats and praying." "Would you like me to write to him?" Ashford asked carefully. "To tell him the truth, gently, in whatever way feels right to you." She considered this for a long moment, staring into the fire crackling low in her small hearth. "I think so," she said finally. "Not to burden him with guilt he does not deserve to carry. He was a child himself that day, as much a victim of circumstance as anyone. But he should know that a boy gave his life so that he might grow up to become a schoolmaster, might marry, might raise children of his own. That knowledge belongs to him as much as it belongs to us." Ashford nodded, relieved by the calm clarity in her voice, so different from the raw anguish of their first conversation about the letters. Over the following days, they drafted the letter together, sitting at her kitchen table in the evenings after her work was finished, carefully choosing words that honored Peter's memory, without placing undue weight of guilt on a man who had been a frightened boy caught in circumstances beyond his control. During those evenings, something between them continued to shift and settle, the careful trust that had wavered briefly after the revelation slowly rebuilding itself into something steadier than before, tempered now by honesty rather than the comfortable ignorance of their earlier weeks together. Elara found herself, more than once, watching Ashford across the small table as he worked through a difficult sentence, and feeling something warm and unguarded stirring in her chest, an emotion she no longer felt the need to suppress quite so carefully. Her father, upon learning the truth from Elara herself, reacted with a quiet, weathered grief that seemed to settle rather than reopen old wounds, a lifetime of hard-won acceptance allowing him to receive the news with less anger than his daughter had initially feared. He had always suspected, he admitted, that the family involved had known more than they ever acknowledged. Confirmation, however painful, felt in its own strange way like a kind of closure. Word of the truth eventually spread through Cranmore as well, carefully and respectfully, not as scandal or gossip, but as long overdue acknowledgement of a sacrifice the town had honored quietly for years without ever knowing its full significance. Old Tobias, upon hearing the story from Mrs. Fenwick, sought out Ashford at the harbor one evening and simply nodded, a gesture that carried more weight than any words could have offered, an old fisherman's quiet recognition that the young Duke had chosen differently than his father before him. Ashford felt the shift in how the town regarded him as well, the wariness that had greeted his arrival slowly giving way to something closer to cautious respect, earned not through his title or his family's land, but through the simple, difficult act of choosing honesty over the comfortable silence his father had preferred. He understood, more clearly with each passing day, that whatever future he built in Cranmore would need to be built on exactly that foundation, truth chosen deliberately, even when silence would have been easier. The letter to Edwin was sent on a gray morning in early autumn, carried by a rider bound for the northern post roads, and Alara stood at her cottage window watching until the horse disappeared over the hill, feeling a strange lightness settle into her chest that she had not expected. 6 years of carrying her brother's memory alone had finally given way to something shared, something acknowledged beyond the quiet ritual of Sunday flowers, and though the grief itself had not vanished, it had begun, slowly, to loosen its grip. The reply came 3 weeks later, longer than expected, and Ashford rode down to her cottage himself to deliver it, unwilling to trust something so significant to a servant's careless handling. Alara opened the letter with trembling hands, Ashford standing quietly beside her, and read it aloud so they might discover its contents together. Edwin's words, carefully written in a schoolmaster's precise hand, carried none of the coldness of the old Duke's correspondence. He wrote of vague, half-remembered fear from that summer, of cold water and desperate hands pulling him toward a rock, of being told simply that he had survived an accident and would be going away to live with new family soon after. He had never known the name of the boy who saved him. He had never known that boy had died in the effort. He wrote, with evident emotion bleeding through his careful penmanship, that he intended to travel to Cranmore himself before winter set in, to see the town where his life had been saved, and to finally pay proper respects to the memory of the boy whose sacrifice had given him every year he had lived since, every year with his wife, every year watching his own children grow. Alara set the letter down, tears finally falling freely, though these carried none of the bitter weight her earlier tears had held. "He wants to come here," she said softly. "He wants to properly know what Peter did." "That seems right," Ashford said gently. "Perhaps it is the final piece this whole story has been missing. Not just the truth spoken aloud between the two of us, but acknowledgement offered directly, by the very life your brother saved." Edwin arrived in Cranmore on a crisp morning 3 weeks later, a quiet, thoughtful man with his young wife accompanying him, and the town received them with a curiosity tempered by genuine warmth, understanding by then the full weight of the story that had brought them to this small harbor town. Ashford arranged for them to stay at Cranmore Hall itself, a gesture that carried its own quiet significance, the family's grand house finally opening its doors to honor rather than hide the truth it had once so carefully buried. On the morning of his second day in Cranmore, Edwin asked to be taken to the cliff, and Alara walked with him herself, Ashford following a respectful distance behind, understanding that this particular moment belonged fully to the two people most directly touched by what had happened there so many years before. They stood together at the flat stone worn smooth by 6 years of Sunday visits, the sea churning gently below, gulls circling overhead in the pale morning light, and Edwin knelt slowly, laying a small bundle of flowers he had carried with him from York, his hands unsteady with an emotion too large for words. "I am sorry it took so long," he said quietly. To Peter, to Alara, to the years of silence that had denied a family the simple comfort of proper gratitude, I did not know. I would have come sooner had anyone told me the truth. Alara knelt beside him, placing her own flowers alongside his, and for the first time in 6 years, felt the particular loneliness of her Sunday ritual finally ease, replaced by something closer to shared remembrance than solitary grief. "He would have liked you," she said softly, watching the flowers drift toward the water's edge. "He always said the sea gave as much as it took, if people were only brave enough to meet it honestly. I think he would be glad to know his sacrifice let you build the life you have now." Edwin stayed in Cranmore for nearly a week, speaking with Alara's father, walking the harbor path, slowly piecing together the fuller picture of the boy whose courage had shaped the entire remainder of his own life. Before he left, he asked Ashford whether a proper marker might be placed at the cliff, something permanent, something that would ensure Peter Whitmore's sacrifice remained visible to the town for generations beyond just Alara's faithful Sunday visits. Ashford agreed without hesitation, and within a month, a simple stone marker stood at the edge of the cliff, engraved with Peter's name and the date of his sacrifice, along with words Alara herself had chosen carefully, describing not the manner of his death, but the courage of his living, the reckless, generous love for the sea and for the people around him, that had defined his short life far more than its ending ever could. The town gathered on the day the marker was unveiled, fishermen and shopkeepers and children who had never known Peter Whitmore standing quietly at the cliff edge, as Alara spoke a few brief words about her brother, her voice steady now in a way it had never quite managed during the private grief of her solitary Sunday visits. Ashford stood beside her throughout the ceremony, and when it concluded, he knelt at the stone himself, laying flowers of his own for the first time, a public acknowledgement from the very family whose silence had once denied Peter the recognition he deserved. In the weeks that followed, something settled between Ashford and Alara that neither of them needed to name aloud, a steadiness built not on the comfortable ignorance of their earliest meetings, but on the harder, more honest foundation of truth faced together, however painful its arrival had been. Their evening walks along the harbor continued, though now without the careful guardedness that had once colored every conversation, replaced instead by an easy familiarity that surprised them both with its depth. It was on a clear evening in late autumn, the sky streaked gold and violet above the harbor, that Ashford finally found the courage to say aloud what had been building quietly within him since that first storm, when she had opened her cottage door to a soaked and shivering Duke with nowhere else to turn. "I did not come to Cranmore expecting to find anything beyond debt and disrepair," he said, as they walked the familiar path along the cliff, not far from Peter's stone marker. "I certainly did not expect to find you, or the particular kind of courage it takes to carry grief so faithfully, for so long, without ever once asking anyone to carry it alongside you." Alara stopped walking, turning to face him fully, something warm and unguarded visible in her expression. The last careful walls she had maintained since their first meeting finally, entirely, lowered. "I did not expect to find anyone brave enough to bring me the truth I had waited 6 years to hear either," she said quietly, "or steady enough to stand beside me while I learned how to carry it." He took her hands then, the same steady grip that had held hers through the terror of the storm, through the raw grief of the lighthouse confession, through every careful step that had brought them to this particular evening on the cliff where her brother's memory now stood properly honored. "I do not know how to promise you a life without further storms," he said, his voice carrying more emotion than he had allowed himself to show since his own mother's death years before. "I can only promise that whatever comes, I intend to face it beside you, honestly, without the silence my family once believed was easier than truth. That is all I have ever wanted," she said softly. And when he knelt at the cliff edge, not far from her brother's stone marker, and asked her to marry him, she said yes with a certainty that carried none of the careful hesitation that had once defined nearly every choice she made. They were married the following spring, in the small stone church overlooking the harbor. The entire town gathered to witness a union that felt, to everyone present, like the natural conclusion of a story that had begun with quiet grief, and ended in something far more hopeful than anyone in Cranmore could have predicted the day a lonely young woman first knelt at the cliff edge with flowers no one yet understood. Edwin and his family returned for the wedding, standing among the Cranmore villagers as honored guests rather than strangers. The connection between two families once separated by tragedy and silence, now bound together by honesty and, eventually, genuine friendship. Alara's father walked her down the narrow aisle with tears he made no effort to hide, proud beyond words of the daughter who had carried grief with such quiet dignity for so many years, and who had finally, deservedly, found happiness alongside it. The wedding breakfast stretched long into the afternoon, tables set out along the harbor wall itself, fishermen's families mingling easily with the handful of guests Ashford had invited from London, a blending of worlds that would have seemed impossible only a year earlier. Mrs. Pratt from the general shop brought her finest preserves. Old Tobias played a battered fiddle late into the evening, and Mrs. Fenwick declared, to anyone who would listen, that she had known from the very first knowing look shared across the market square that this particular match had been written by something larger than either of the two people involved. Whitfield, watching the celebration from a quiet corner with evident satisfaction, remarked to Ashford at one point that Cranmore Hall had not seen a gathering so full of genuine warmth since long before the old Duke's failing health had closed its doors to the wider world. Ashford, watching Alara laugh freely among the fishing families she had known her whole life, thought privately that the house had perhaps never truly known this kind of warmth at all, not in his father's time, not even in the earlier years he barely remembered before his mother's death. In the months that followed their marriage, Ashford threw himself into restoring not just the physical state of Cranmore Hall, but its relationship with the town it had long stood somewhat apart from. He established a proper fund for fishing families who lost boats or livelihoods to storms, insisted that estate tenants receive fair and transparent accounting, rather than the confusing, often exploitative arrangements his father had allowed to persist, and quietly ensured that any child in Cranmore wishing to learn to read or swim properly, as Peter had once dreamed of teaching, received the opportunity to do so. Alara, for her part, found herself gradually stepping into a role she had never imagined for herself, welcomed by the town not merely as the Duke's wife, but as a bridge between the grand house on the hill and the harbor below, someone who understood intimately both the hardships of Cranmore's fishing families and the particular responsibilities now resting on her husband's shoulders. She continued her needlework for a time, less from necessity than from a reluctance to entirely abandon the quiet, steady work that had shaped so much of her identity before everything changed. 2 years into their marriage, their first child arrived, a daughter they named Grace, born on a mild spring morning with her father's steady gray eyes and, everyone in Cranmore agreed, her mother's quiet, watchful composure even from her earliest days. A son followed 2 years after, given the name Peter without any need for discussion between his parents, the choice understood by both of them as the most natural thing in the world. As their children grew, Alara found herself explaining, gently and at an age-appropriate pace, the story of the uncle they carried in name but had never known, the courage that had defined his short life, the years of quiet grief that had eventually given way to something far more hopeful. She told them of storms and lighthouses and letters found in locked drawers, of a schoolmaster in York who visited most summers now with his own growing family, the two households bound together by history neither generation had chosen but both had come to cherish. Edwin's visits became a treasured tradition of their own, his children growing up alongside Grace and young Peter, playing along the same harbor where their families' fates had first intertwined so tragically and, eventually, so hopefully. On these visits, Edwin would often walk with Alara to the cliff himself, standing quietly beside the stone marker that bore her brother's name, a ritual of gratitude that had long since replaced whatever guilt he might once have carried for a tragedy that had never truly been his fault. Every Sunday after their marriage, Alara continued walking to the cliff, though no longer alone. Ashford walked beside her now, and often, when their own children grew old enough, they joined as well. The ritual transformed slowly from solitary mourning into a family tradition of remembrance, honoring not just Peter's sacrifice, but the entire long, difficult journey that had led two grieving strangers toward a shared and steady love neither of them had expected to find on a quiet cliff above the restless, ever-changing sea. Years later, when Grace herself was old enough to ask why the family visited the cliff so faithfully each week, Alara would kneel beside her daughter at the familiar flat stone, worn smoother now by decades rather than mere years, and tell her, in the same steady voice she had once used to finally share the truth with a curious young duke, the story of a boy who loved the sea enough to give everything for someone he had never even properly met. It was, she told her daughter, the truest kind of love there was, the kind that asked for nothing in return, and it deserved, always, to be remembered. 10 years after the wedding at the small stone church overlooking the harbor, Cranmore had grown into a town scarcely recognizable to those who remembered its quieter, harder years, before the young duke and his wife began quietly reshaping its fortunes. A proper schoolhouse now stood near the market square, funded largely through the estate, its walls lined with books that any child in town could borrow freely, a detail Alara had insisted upon from the very beginning, remembering her own childhood spent teaching herself to read from a single battered volume left behind by her mother. Grace, now 9 years old, had become something of a fixture at the schoolhouse herself, arriving early most mornings to help the younger children with their letters before her own lessons began, a habit that reminded Alara, with a familiar ache of both grief and pride, of the uncle her daughter had never known but had somehow inherited a portion of his generous spirit regardless. It was during one of these ordinary mornings, the harbor bright with early summer light, that a stranger arrived in Cranmore asking after the Whitmore family, though by then, of course, the name most people in town used was Cole. The stranger, an elderly man with careful formal manners, introduced himself as a solicitor representing a family from the northern counties, and requested a private audience with the Duke regarding a matter he described only as delicate and long overdue. Ashford received him in the same study where he had once discovered his father's locked drawer, curiosity mixed with a faint unease he could not entirely place. The solicitor explained, after some careful preamble, that he represented the extended family of the old Duke's late brother, Ashford's own uncle, who had recently passed away leaving behind papers of his own that touched upon the very same summer tragedy Ashford had uncovered years before. It seemed that Ashford's uncle had known considerably more of the matter than the original letters suggested, having quietly arranged, at the time, for a modest sum to be set aside for the Whitmore family, a gesture of guilt-ridden conscience that had never actually been delivered, buried instead alongside the rest of the family's careful silence. The uncle's own recent death and the settling of his estate had finally brought the matter to light, and his solicitor now sought Ashford's guidance on how the outstanding matter might be properly resolved after so many years. Ashford listened to the account with a complicated mixture of anger and weary recognition, the same cowardice that had defined his father apparently having infected an entire generation of the family, each man aware, in some fashion, of what had truly happened, each man choosing silence and convenience over the harder work of honest acknowledgement. He thanked the solicitor for bringing the matter forward at last, and after some consideration, decided the funds should not go to himself or Alara, who required nothing further from a family that had already given them the greater gift of truth and, eventually, love, but should instead establish a proper scholarship in Peter Whitmore's name, ensuring that any child in Cranmore with talent and ambition beyond what their family could otherwise afford might pursue an education, regardless of circumstance. Alara, when told of the arrangement that evening, wept quietly for a moment, not from grief this time, but from something closer to overwhelmed gratitude, moved by the thought of her brother's name attached permanently to opportunity for children who would never know him personally, but would carry forward, in their own way, the same generous spirit that had defined his short life. The scholarship was established within the month, and its first recipient, a fisherman's son named Oliver with a particular gift for mathematics that had gone entirely unnoticed until a visiting tutor recognized it, went on to study at university in Edinburgh, the first person from Cranmore's fishing families ever to do so. He wrote to Alara and Ashford faithfully throughout his studies, describing lectures and discoveries with an enthusiasm that reminded them both, in different ways, of the boundless curiosity Peter had once carried for the sea and everything beyond it. Edwin, informed of the scholarship during his family's next summer visit, insisted on contributing to its funding as well, a gesture Ashford initially resisted, before recognizing that refusing would deny Edwin his own long-overdue opportunity to properly honor the sacrifice that had shaped his entire life. The two families, once separated by tragedy and generations of careful silence, now found themselves bound together not merely by history, but by shared purpose, a partnership neither Alara nor Ashford could have imagined during those first uncertain weeks after his arrival in Cranmore. As the years continued to pass, the cliff itself changed gradually as well, the town eventually planting a small garden of hardy coastal flowers around Peter's stone marker, tended by volunteers and, most faithfully, by Alara herself, who still visited every Sunday morning, though her purpose there had shifted subtly over the years, less a ritual of solitary grief now than a quiet, grateful acknowledgement of everything that single tragic summer had eventually grown into. Grace, watching her mother tend the garden one particular Sunday morning not long after her 10th birthday, asked whether she too might someday be allowed to bring flowers to the cliff on her own, without her parents accompanying her, the way her mother once had. Alara considered the request carefully, recognizing in her daughter's earnest expression something of her own childhood determination, and agreed, on the condition that Grace understood the full story behind the ritual she wished to carry forward herself. That evening, mother and daughter sat together by the fire, and Alara told the story properly, from the very beginning, the reckless boy who loved the sea more than caution ever allowed, the terrible summer that took him, the years of solitary grief that followed, and the storm that had eventually brought a soaked and shivering Duke to her cottage door, setting into motion everything that followed. Grace listened with the rapt attention of a child hearing her family's most important story for the first time in its complete form, and when her mother finished, she asked only one question, quiet and thoughtful in the firelight. "Do you think Uncle Peter would be happy," she asked, "with how everything turned out?" Alara considered the question seriously, thinking of the schoolhouse now standing where empty lots once sat, of Oliver's letters from Edinburgh filled with wonder and ambition, of Edwin's children playing along the same harbor where their family's history had first intertwined, of her own two children growing up surrounded by a town that remembered, properly and permanently, the courage that had once saved a stranger's life at the cost of its own. "I think," she said finally, choosing her words with the same careful honesty Ashford had once brought to her own kitchen table years before, "that your uncle would be glad the sea gave something back, eventually, even if it took its own time in doing so. He always believed the water gave as much as it took, if people were brave enough to meet it honestly. I think he would say that everything that grew from his sacrifice, this town, this family, all of it, proves he was right." Grace nodded slowly, satisfied with the answer, and the following Sunday, she walked to the cliff alone for the first time, her small hand carrying a single wildflower gathered from the garden her mother had helped establish around the stone marker, continuing a tradition that had begun in solitary grief and grown, across a decade and 2 generations, into something far larger and more hopeful than anyone standing on that cliff on its very first Sunday could ever have imagined. Ashford watched his daughter's small figure disappear over the ridge that Sunday morning, from the same study window where he had once stood as a stranger to Cranmore, uncertain of his place in the town, or the life waiting for him there, and felt a quiet gratitude settle over him that he had never quite managed to put into words, even after all the years that had passed. He thought of his father, gone now more than a decade, and found that the old bitterness he once carried had softened, over time, into something closer to sorrow for a man who had never found the courage to choose truth over comfort, who had died without ever knowing the life his own silence had nearly cost his son the chance to build. Elara joined him at the window, resting her hand lightly on his arm, and together they watched the last of Grace's small figure vanish over the hill toward the cliff, following a path first walked in solitary grief, and now carried forward by a new generation in hope rather than sorrow. "She will be fine," Elara said softly, more reassurance for herself than for him, though she does look very small out there alone. "She has more courage than either of us realizes," Ashford said, remembering the fierce, quiet strength he had first glimpsed in Elara herself on a rain-soaked cliff years before he ever knew her name. "I imagine she comes by it honestly, from more than one direction." They stood together at the window a while longer, the harbor spread out below them bright and busy in the summer morning, boats returning with the day's catch, children's laughter drifting faintly up from the schoolyard, the whole town moving through its ordinary rhythms, unaware, mostly, of how close it had once come to remaining a place defined by silence and buried grief, rather than the honest, hard-won peace it now enjoyed. When Grace returned an hour later, her cheeks pink from the wind, her small hands empty of the flower she had carried up, she reported proudly that she had said everything her mother taught her to say, and that she had sat for a while afterward simply listening to the sea, the way her mother always did, and that she thought, though she could not be entirely certain, that the water had sounded almost gentle that morning, as though it too understood that some griefs, given enough time and enough honesty, could finally be allowed to rest. The sea below continued its endless rhythm, crashing and retreating, indifferent as always to the particular griefs and joys of the small town perched along its edge, and yet somehow, in the quiet way that time occasionally allows, it had eventually returned what it once took. Not the boy himself, who remained forever 16 in the town's collective memory, but something perhaps equally valuable, a family healed, a truth finally spoken, and a love that had grown, slowly and honestly, from the very grief that once seemed as though it might never properly heal at all.